This episode discusses topics related to suicide loss. If this is a difficult conversation for you, I want to make sure you take extra care or pause and step away and skip this episode for now. Please know that you can reach out at the crisis hotline at 988. Welcome back to Adaptive Humans, the podcast where we engage in real talk and intentional growth. I'm your host, Jami de Lou. At the heart of this podcast are three anchors I'll keep returning to: emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, and nervous system regulation. They're the compass that helps us connect, adapt, and lead, especially in moments that stretch us. To learn more about these concepts, you can listen to a short overview in our first episode. If you caught episode 2, we talked about grief anniversaries and the impact they have on us individually and collectively. I shared some of how grief is an intimately woven part of my own story. As part 2 of this conversation, I'm honored to have a special guest today, Kerri Soukup, a creative leader and founder of the Sentiment Project. Before I introduce Kerri, I want to remind everyone of purposeful vulnerability. This is a core value of the show, especially when addressing sensitive topics like grief, and today, where we'll talk about suicide loss. Purposeful vulnerability is about choosing what to share with others, not oversharing or feeling pressured, but opening up in a way that builds trust, connection, and growth instead of exposure. Today's guest, Kerri Soukup, has spent 25 years as a purpose-driven creative advertising leader, often at the intersection of empathy and creativity. 19, Kerri began sharing her story as a suicide loss survivor, and that's when what started as a passion project began to grow into the Sentiment Project, a space that uses creativity to make meaning of loss and heal in community. Since then, her voice and volunteer work have been featured everywhere from State Street in Chicago to ABC Sunday Morning News. Kerri has been highly influenced by what she refers to as her rest era as she manages her consulting practice and the Sentiment Project. We're so grateful to have Kerri here with us today. Kerri, welcome to Adaptive Humans. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Jami. It's great to see you.
I'm so excited for everyone to get to hear more about your story and just to be a part of our conversation today. While I've shared a little bit with our listeners about your background and introduction, in our Beyond the Bio segment, we go deeper than titles and resumes. We really do tap into more about values, experiences, and stories that shape who we really are. And so I'd love to kick off with, you said growing up in rural Kansas shaped your grit. How did it influence how you show up in the world now?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that question. I do think that my Kansas roots are a huge part of who I am. You don't realize that, when you're growing up and when that's kind of just what you know. But now I've lived in Chicago for about 26 years, and I really feel like those two sort of, aspects, like more, city kind of experiences and, moving here to work in advertising, contrasted with my Kansas roots. And not just my Kansas roots, like I grew up in a town of 2,000 people. That's kind of an exaggeration, a little bit smaller than that.
Okay.
We were the big town of all the little towns in that rural part of Kansas, like right in the middle of the state. I'm so grateful for it now. I never, would have even thought to articulate it that way when I was growing up there and when I even first moved to Chicago. But I really do feel that having that less traditional path has played a really big role in me being able to stay authentic as a creative leader and just, as a human, the way that I show up in the world. I think that, a lot of people who come into advertising, it's great. Like every path is great, but it's about me being able to recognize that my path is okay too. And I remember first coming into the to Chicago and into the industry and kind of feeling like, am I supposed to be here? Like I didn't have this similar type of background to a portfolio school. I didn't study like at the traditional ad schools. And I'm so grateful that early in my career, I was able to almost be rewarded for that. And feel good, to stay authentic through everything. I just think that that kind of middle ground that that perspective gives me of being connected to the rural Kansas roots as well as the city, aspects has been really, really helpful. And then I would say empathy is something that I, again, growing up would never have thought that or articulated it that way. But, I had really humble roots, not just Kansas roots, but super humble. My mom and dad divorced when I was 5. So my mom was single for years before her and my stepdad remarried. I was the oldest of 3 kids, but we were super close in age. And we're all like 3 of us are within a 4-year span. So, like, a lot of responsibility kind of came with that, even though I probably didn't realize that at the time. And I remember being aware that we didn't have a lot and
Mm.
feeling like this weight and pressure to earn, like I rode my bike into town ever since maybe I could remember, like being 10 years old, for babysitting gigs and just ways that I could help out and earn money. Even waitressing, like I paid my way through college and I did early morning breakfast shifts, got up on the weekends at 4:30 in the morning to go in and open at Country Kitchen. I just think like those things kind of connected that to grit and resilience, but I realized that those things really have also helped me cultivate empathy over time.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, it's not just grit, but it's definitely grit and resilience. It's so interesting because you think about ad agency and how important it actually would be to have employees from different backgrounds and walks of life and experiences to have the lens to see and catch the things. And we think about all the oh no ads that we've all experienced in society. And someone's always asking, was no one looking at this? And it's not that no one was looking at it, but like the perspective it requires to have a lot of different lenses to see the world through. And I think the depth of your story and that balance between spending so much of your life in a really small town with your, humble beginnings to living in Chicago and having more of a metropolitan city life that you live can be very different. And both of those experiences seem to have really cultivated a lot in your life.
Yeah, I value it so much more as time has passed. I remember moving to Chicago and being hard to imagine
Mm.
not living in a city.
Mhm.
And now I value nature. When we go back to Kansas, just being able to see the stars in the sky and hear the sounds at night. Like it's just, I just appreciate it so much more now. The wheat fields, like I love driving to the state. I used to be like, oh, this is such a boring flat state. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. Like we have the most beautiful sunsets, the wheat fields before it's time to harvest. I just appreciate all of that so much. It's being able to hold space for both of those things, like you said.
I'm so grateful to have you share that aspect and just the joy that comes through when I can see you talking about it is meaningful. And I'm hoping that, Adaptive Humans is going to attract listeners from all over the country, from different walks of life. And I think it's important for people to see people who have similar experiences to them, hopefully in future episodes as guests here. I want to tap into that resilience kind of thought a little bit more. And I know from your experience losing your dad to suicide as a high school senior, you've talked about with me as a defining moment. How did that experience shape your empathy and your perspective on the world? I know empathy continues to be a theme when you and I talked before, but even you've brought it up already once. I'd love to hear more about how that shaped you.
Yeah, again, these things with hindsight and with perspective now, we can see that. And at the time, I didn't necessarily see that. But I do think in reflection over time, I've come to know that one of the biggest marks on my journey with empathy did start when I was a senior in high school and I just wasn't consciously aware of it. So, yeah, this is the year that my dad died by suicide. I mentioned earlier that my parents divorced when I was 5, my sister and brother and I being really close in age. I was a senior in high school, and that made my sister and my brother sophomore and freshman age that year. It was 1992. There was so much trauma in his life and in his death. We weren't consistently close, or he wasn't a consistent presence in our life. He was there at times, but it just wasn't consistent. And that all already can be a lot to process as, a child growing up during
Mm,
divorce, through divorce. I think when he died, that was also part of what made grieving kind of difficult and just confusing for me and for, others around me too. Not to mention, the rural Kansas aspect that I had shared and the year being 1992. And while we have come a long ways and we still have much further to come with stigma and shame and being open about, tools and therapy and other things that we can do to process and to grieve and to heal, I certainly, as a 17-year-old girl in Ellsworth, Kansas in the 90s, I did not have that. I didn't realize at that time that I didn't have it. You just kind of cope, right? I talked about that grit, that
Mm.
resilience. You just kind of keep going through it. 5 years later, when I was studying graphic design in college in another town about an hour west of my hometown, the college is Fort Hays State University. I think hand in hand with that moment of losing my dad to suicide, I also think that when you talk about defining moments, I think that a choice that I made when I was studying graphic design to confront those emotions of my dad's suicide through a project that we were assigned in college, it's something I look back now on as such a gift that I could have never plan for myself by using that project to process emotions that I had already started to acknowledge, but it allowed emotions to come up that I didn't even know were inside of me. I think having that happen at that point in time was also such a defining moment. It was enough distance to be able to have different perspective than perhaps even if I would have been in therapy the very next week after it happened. It's something I'm just so grateful for.
I think about if there's listeners listening who can't really fathom in 1992, there was no phones. Like, if you wanted to be in contact with someone, even to talk to your best friend even, you had to call someone's landline back then, and you had to ask for them usually when their parents answered the phone. It was a very different time. So that idea of texting with someone to connect with another person, or social media, or even Google searching, like none of that existed. So the access to information being limited in that time frame, I think is such an important context to the story, which I think is a beautiful anchor to that, which is creativity, regardless of technology, is a really powerful thing. And it can be used to process emotions. It can be used for healing. It can be used for all kinds of things. And it really sounds like, from everything you've told me about this project you did in college, that it really made a huge difference in your life in that moment. And I'm excited for listeners to hear more about, how that's carried on in your life. As we talk more about a brave enough moment, the segment Brave Enough Moment is how we step forward in action, even when it's messy and uncertain. Because courage doesn't mean being perfect. It means being just brave enough, just that first step. I always like to say that's the difference between being brave enough is not the leap all the way across the Grand Canyon, if you will, but it's walking to the ledge to say that I can see the step that is before me and I'm going to take action, what I feel called to do next. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the role that creativity has played in your healing process.
I think that's so powerful how you put the brave enough point, and there's the bravery and then there's the enough, and having that trust that it will be enough and not kind of like over analyzing that too. It's interesting when we started talking about this, and we can look back on it now and you can call it brave, but for me, there wasn't any bravery about it. It just was this deep, deep conviction. I do proudly, I guess, like look back on it now and say that that was a brave moment, but it just felt just so almost like out of body, like there wasn't even a choice, like it was just what I was supposed to do. It was a project that we always knew. It was fairly late in the program. It wasn't your final sort of, year portfolio level, but it was pretty far along. It's one of those projects that you kind of knew was coming, and it was a big thing in the program. And for some reason, even when I first entered the graphics program, I just had this feeling like that was the subject matter I was going to take on. Then it came and it was time to do it. And I was juggling those waitressing shifts I told you about, art history tests, other deadlines. And it was like, oh my gosh, it's here. I I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. I was just so confused. Like, what is happening? This project I've been waiting for, here it is. So my professor, who I adore and will just forever be my hero and such an amazing mentor, I remember so vividly we had the first sort of critique or first sort of check-in, and I just sat over in the corner of the room and I just waited till everybody else went because I didn't have anything. I was so stuck. My sketchbook was like blank. I didn't have anything. And then after everybody was kind of gone, I went over and talked to him and I just had a blank page and I said, Chaiwat, that's his name, Chaiwat. Chaiwat, I'm stuck. I don't know what I'm gonna do, but I just need more time. I'll be back. And he asked what I was gonna do it on, and I told him, and he said, well, Kerri, that's a really heavy subject. Like maybe you just need to pivot to something else. And I said, no, I just had this inner, like, such strong conviction that this is what I was supposed to do. And he said, why? Why do you feel so strongly? And then I told him why. And he said, you will figure it out. And literally that night, I went back to my apartment where I lived with my roommate, my little college apartment. And I remember laying in bed that night and just kept saying over and over to myself, like, why did he do it? Why did he do it? Why did he do it? Asking myself this. And my dad, sounded like E in my head.
Mm.
And from that moment, I was just like, it just started flowing. I think, that confidence that my professor instilled in me was really, really important to, like, probably fully give me permission as well and to believe in myself to be able to do it. The project was to create a conceptual alphabet book, and we could use the letters in any way that we wanted. You could use photography, you could use typography, you could use illustration, whatever you wanted, as long as you somehow use the letters to tell a story. E that night became my main character, and all of the other letters have a role that they play with depicting different words and phrases that embody the emotions that I allowed myself to confront and begin to process and feel when I put myself in E's shoes. E has gone on to really represent empathy for me.
Mm.
Again, like something I wasn't totally conscious of when I was creating the book back in college, but it really was this pivotal moment in really allowing myself to grieve that then opens up the door for the forgiveness and for the healing that would come after that.
That's such a beautiful and powerful experience, and I recognize, like you said, we're looking and analyzing this both through being more seasoned in life, an adult's lens of looking back, but how a sound playing in your head over and over again gave you the word that connected to it. But I also think about the role of the professor that they play, and in the part one of this two-part episode in navigating grief, one of the things I talked about is the power of being able to speak about your grief, to be able to share it, to be able to have others, not shy away from it. And so, in some ways, you can respect the fact that he said you don't have to do this subject. He gave you the out. But when you said your why, what was so wonderful was for you to have someone there that said, oh, well, then you're going to find your way. This is what you're gonna do, and made it okay. It wasn't like he shut you down completely in doing this project or doing it about this topic that is so challenging at that point in your life, and I think we underestimate sometimes the role that people can play in our lives and the role that we can play in others' lives, and it is, again, that E somehow in that moment, it was empathy that he was showing you to care enough to say, "If you don't wanna do this, you don't have to, but if you will, then I'm here and I know you're gonna do it." And that's the most beautiful display of empathy in that moment that I see this thread that's now carried through, and what you created, it sounds like. That's such a
Yeah,
beautiful
thank
thing.
you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, and I don't think I mentioned, I actually have the book here, and I don't know if you all can see it through the
Yeah.
camera, but it's
Yeah.
pretty large,
Yeah.
and you can see the title here on the front. It's called Sentiment. The book, this was 1997, and so I made this in college, and I did the perfect binding, not perfect like I did it perfectly, but a
Yeah.
style of binding,
Yes.
a
Yeah.
style.
Yeah. Got
And
it.
so I did it all myself. So I had to have it done ahead of time that I could get the whole thing bound. I had to go to the Hayes newspaper where I took my own paper that I purchased ahead of time and took there so that they could run it through their printers with a large enough format. So it took like a lot of planning to be able to get this done and meet the deadline and then do the binding myself. You might see this, there's a little hole that like is drilled all the way through the book there. And that was really important to me to be able to have that done in a way that didn't damage the book after I put all of that work into creating it. I found a person in the print shop on the campus, like there on campus, who we did tests. I took over the basically the materials that I knew my final book was going to be made out of. And we did tests. I still remember him to this day. His name was John, and he cared so much about making this work and be perfect for me. And he didn't even fully know, what I was doing and why. But he helped me drill this through here in a way that wouldn't damage the book. So it represented, and I shared this with my class when I presented it to them at the end, and it reveal who E is and what had happened with E. And yeah, and so for me, how that represented a bullet hole and really could represent loss for anybody, in whatever way that resonated for them and was true for their story. And it comes right at the end of the book. The very last spread in the book says, it's kind of like the punctuation there at the end of the sentence,
Mm.
"You will always be a part of me." Again, I didn't know that when I made the book originally, but then later, reflecting back on it, I just realized how beautiful it was that I had come to this place of acceptance and forgiveness by the time I got to the last page of and last spread of the book. And that was really by attending a grief counseling workshop that would come so many years later when I even like became conscious of that. When you were kind of talking about the timeline earlier, I think it's so true to reinforce and to emphasize that we shouldn't judge ourselves or be expect things to happen on any certain timeline and just to kind of allow it when it does start to come.
There really is no finite amount of time with grief, and everyone's journey and process and how you process it, depending on what type of grief you're navigating, what's the circumstances, and just sort of how you flow through it. And I think one of the things I also talked about in the part one episode was in processing it. It's not just in our minds, it's in our bodies and being able to release aspects of the grief. And that some of that can be physical release, but also the creative release. And that writing, journaling, music, anything that feels like a creative aspect, painting, art, things like that can actually be a physical exchange, a creative exchange about processing it. I think sometimes as we're ready, we go to that next level, that next stage. And I think there's so much of your story I know and how you started to share more of your story publicly in 2019 was a really big step for you. And I can imagine as a part of your sort of brave enough journey, can you take us back to 2019 and just a little bit of your journey to now to the Sentiment Project and how speaking about suicide loss and the role it's played in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. When I look back at 2019, that was another pivotal year. Had been feeling a pull for a while. So the 2 previous years, I had discovered the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They do a walk annually, and it's called the Out of the Darkness Walk. I had discovered that in 2017 and literally saw a little sign for it, and the words "out of the darkness" and this idea of the stigma and the shame and bringing that out of the darkness spoke to me so much that when I realized it was a walk that was happening with AFSP here in Chicago, it was the next day. We went out to Grant Park and we walked among strangers, and it was really beautiful. At this point, this is actually probably 25 years from my dad's death. I was just walking among strangers. I had tears coming down my face that I didn't even know were still in me. Doing that experience with Derek and with these strangers was, it sounds cliche because it's a walk and it's, out of the darkness walk, but it literally was like such an important just steps that I started taking. I can look back on it and think and say that that really was a marker of these steps that I continued to take forward and really taking my book off the shelf and making more steps forward in my healing. So, yeah, in 2019, it just was the year that I had said out loud, to your point earlier, like that
Mhm.
importance of, doing that sometimes. Not always, but there is an aspect of that, I think, that can like help us also follow through on it, for ourselves and by doing that. So I had said to Derek and to myself that this was the year I really wanted to walk out loud more, like be more open and public about what I was walking for. And I never hid being a suicide loss survivor, but it just wasn't something that would come up very often unless it's a friend you got really close with or
Mhm.
some sort of specific situation. It was really important to me that year that I did that. And it just so happened as I was getting more involved with American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, I was following them on social media and I saw that they were having this grief counseling workshop and it was 2 blocks from my condo. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I have to do this. I had a friend who actually we got reconnected through the walk a previous year, didn't even know that we both shared suicide loss. We both saw that each other were out there. We were reconnected, and she was supposed to come to this grief counseling workshop with me. But then something came up with her work. She had to go out of town. So Derek came with me. We were in this workshop and brilliant professor who they had brought in to take us through this whole experience of an afternoon. I have my workbook out and I'm jotting notes as we're going. And without even meaning to, as we were going through these different aspects and stages of grief, I found myself like jotting in the side notes different words and spreads from my book. And I kind of got to the end of it. I wasn't even consciously doing that. And then I got to the end of it, had an aha moment like, oh my goodness, my book isn't done in chapters, but if it was, these are like the chapters of the different stages of grief. And that 3-week project that I did back in college, just what an encapsulation that was of that experience of allowing myself to go through those stages of grief. I was just feeling very, very moved from this experience. And we're walking that 2-block walk back to our condo after the workshop is finished. And I just remember looking at Derek and kind of stopping like mid step and he was like, what's wrong? And I'm just like, I just know I'm supposed to do something.
Mhm.
I know, feeling it so strongly. And I remember saying this, like so frustrated, but I don't know what it is. And I must have said that multiple times. And I remember him looking at me and just saying, you don't need to know what it is. And I remember getting mad and being like, yes, I do. I have to know what it is. That's how I work. I'm a creative and I get this vision and then I get after it and I start working towards it. And I just don't know what it is. And he was like, Kerri, you just need to take your book off the shelf. And I was mad at him. You just make it sound so easy. You think that, I just remember feeling frustrated. But then soon after that, during 2019, I did start taking my book off the shelf and I revisited feelings I'd had from 22 years prior when I had made it in college. And most all of it really stood up to the same ways that I felt then, but there were some pages that were different. So I just started creating and not really worrying about what the end thing was even going to be. I would look at a spread in my book and I would reflect and think about it. And one, for example, that I would love to share with you because I do have it here. There's a spread in my book where it just says we all have problems and it's just like wallpaper, like continued across the entire spread. When I revisited it later, can you see this? You
Yeah.
can oh, we all have is really heavy at the top, this big burden and weight. And then problems is wallpapered across the entire spread instead of just we all have problems, kind of just was to me now when I look back on it and the nature of how I thought about that was, well, we all have problems. So why do some people choose this? And now I look at it as like, my goodness, like the weight of that. And I just see so much more empathy in this graphic depiction of it.
Yeah.
than the version I had made back in college. So it just became this like exercise that was for me and only for me. And then the steps like to continue to take forward just started becoming much more apparent to me. I started thinking about what you were saying around the saying it out loud too, how that experience back in college, that 3 weeks of just me going inside, the power of that, but then the experience of sharing it out loud with my class when I had been working in secrecy because it needed to be the end product before I shared it with anybody. And there was so much power in that that I started realizing I wanted to find ways to extend that experience to more people. So I first converted all of the pages of my book into Instagram posts. And that year in 19, leading up to the Out of the Darkness walk, 5 days or however many days in a row, I released one post a day that was a translation of my book spreads. And that was how I started telling my story. And then after that, I did a book sharing event. Again, how do I just take my book off the shelf and how do I start using that to continue to help myself heal and others heal? And it was 2020 in the fall that I started to feel ready to create a conversation series, a virtual space with 6 suicide loss survivors at a time. And we use creativity, which I consider to be a safe space to process our trauma and our grief. And everyone who participated is a suicide loss survivor. And they came together to kind of know that they had this community of people where they could share vulnerably things that maybe in other forums they'd never,
Mhm.
other ships, other relationships had never really felt fully safe to share. It's a process that I now call the Create, Share, Heal framework. And we go through this experience together. And every month, as somebody feels ready, after I model the experience up front and share my book and share my story, one person at a time raises their hand to say, this is my month that I'm going to take on a project and come back and share it with the group. And then the conversation that comes from that is just so beautiful. It's the way that people can reflect into other people's stories too, be witnessed
Yeah.
and feel safe to be able to feel brave, back to your brave point. It is really, I hadn't thought about that until you positioned it that way, but it is creating a space that allows people to feel brave, to be vulnerable, to acknowledge those feelings.
That's so incredibly powerful. Not everyone has an experience with suicide loss, but if you do, and I know my first experience, I was actually 13 years old. My mom had this tendency when I was growing up, if something really tragic happened, we would go to the ocean. Or if something miraculous happened or exciting happened, it was like the anchor of this place. I think sometimes processing experiences can be creative. It can be connected to a place that soothes you to tap into how to process an emotion. It can be so many different things, but I do think creating space that is unique for different types of losses and experiences. That's why there are so many different types, thankfully, right, of support communities and nonprofit organizations that are trying to help people in different ways that are really powerful. I was thinking about you sharing that, and I was thinking about the different experiences I've had with suicide loss myself and the loved ones that I've lost. Figuring out ways to process it is really unique. And yet at the same time, it's loss, right? And I was just thinking about I know you've grown in what you've done with the Sentiment Project. You've kind of expanded that around so many different types of loss for people.
Yeah, what you just said, yes, yes, yes. Like I knew that there were parallels even when I made my book. And if somebody sees the post on Sentiment Project on Instagram, it's sentiment_project, and that's where you can see them. If you go through them, you will see that it's done pretty abstractly. And it isn't until the end that I reveal my connection to who E is and really even what has happened to me, when I reflected back on that in that exercise of taking my book off the shelf and reflecting back on a bunch of the feelings and the emotions on the different pages of the book, that's when it became even more apparent to me that there's broader application here beyond suicide loss. And even having to think about the way I did the Instagram, I wanted to make sure that I disclosed that suicide was a primary topic of the space so that that didn't catch anyone off guard. But I also didn't want to make it feel limiting that because I'd had enough people close to me over the years who had looked at my book and said, gosh, I haven't experienced suicide loss specifically, but processing the loss of my mother or processing the loss of a sibling or processing all these other types of loss, they found the framework still so helpful and relatable and applicable. So it's really been kind of deep inside of me had an aspiration to expand it beyond suicide loss, but I wasn't really sure how. And we talked about working in the advertising industry and pretty demanding days and weeks. And so to really like carve out the space to intentionally think about how I would expand it kind of got moved to the back burner, but I would just continue the Sunday conversations with the suicide loss survivor groups and just kind of kept that going. It was in the last year that I really started to create more space to think about what that would look like and really interrogate it and say, should I do that? Should I stay focused on suicide loss? We know there is more than enough to be done there. There's no shortage of what needs to be done there. I've just used the last year to really try some different things and kind of experiment and hold different spaces and see how it felt one step at a time. I've done a couple of workshops around creating space for grief that allow people to bring in other types of loss beyond suicide. And that felt really powerful. I just kind of was like, okay, now what's the next step? So I started a virtual program that instead of going about a year and it's a 1 month program, we meet one night a week for that month. It's about 5 sessions total. A little bit more manageable and less intimidating, a little more approachable to come into that space. I call that space stigma sessions. Grieving in and of itself is stigmatized. Like as society, like we don't naturally make space to grieve. So and then there's so many types of grief that are stigmatized on top of that. Just creating a place where people can not feel like we have to take one type of grief at a time, but where they can have this brave enough space to come into and use creativity to process their loss. I think of the positioning of Sentiment Project as when I had to really interrogate it and think about if I expand beyond suicide loss, like, does the name sentiment still make sense? Because I had named it sentiment back in the day when I did the original project because it's based on emotion rather than logic and reason. And I named it that specifically because that was how I felt about suicide. After I spent that time really thinking about the positioning of expanding Sentiment Project or if it should be something I did alongside it, I was like, no, this is true of grief. This statement is true. This is true of the creative process. This stuff comes in waves. And if we can be brave enough to allow it, that is really true. The power of what we can do if we allow ourselves to get into the emotion and not just the logical side of things. And still going, like I'm not quite sure where it's going to go from here, but I guess I feel so grateful that I'm okay with not knowing, and
Yeah.
I'm just so much more comfortable in the not knowing and just kind of trusting these steps one at a time.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think one of the things you and I talked about beforehand, and I think it's important to articulate to listeners, is that you and I each are probably individuals who use our own lived experience and our own stories in service of others in different aspects of our lives. And the interconnection between the work we do and the lived experience we have is sometimes a close thread. Is that a safe way of saying it, right?
Yeah.
And I think for some people, it is intertwined and it's interconnected, and that's a beautiful thing. And I think you and I both agree on this, which is also, though, it doesn't have to be. Your story with your grief does not have to be one that it has to be in service of others, that you have to use it. You have to tap into your story and share it in any way publicly. That is not required to process and to heal through and to navigate the journey of grief in any way, shape, or form. But I also think it's important for those who feel a nudge, who feel like there's a story inside of them that they want to get out, or because I can so relate to your feeling like that describing that walkway home when you're like, I don't know what it is. I know I'm supposed to do something. I feel like there's so many aspects of my life and moments where I've known wholeheartedly that it's meant to be in service of others, that it's meant to have an impact and a ripple in other ways. But I do think that for those who might be listening who feel that is one thing. If you're listening and you don't feel that nudge, that is also okay. Like there is absolutely no judgment in that. There's no one right way or wrong way. But I think if you feel that nudge, it's really just about taking a step, whatever that first step feels like for you. I know for me, when I was growing up, because I was a dancer, creating choreography and connection to music and movement for me told stories, and I could do it in that way. Now in my career, storytelling has been another way for me. Now, this podcast obviously is another way to be in service of other people. But I think knowing that it doesn't have to be that way, it is a choice, and it is only should that feel like something that is the right step for you to engage in that. Or would you agree with me? I think.
Wholeheartedly. As you were saying that, it was making me think about writing my initial Instagram sort of description. For me, it wasn't about helping others. It was, I had to say, to help myself and others heal. And I believe that. Like, that's been the most beautiful thing, is that I knew going into it that I believe that statement, that I'm going to start sharing my story as a suicide loss survivor to help myself and others heal. But I could not have fathomed the amount of continued healing that I have had, and just how reciprocal that has been throughout this whole journey.
Yeah.
With that story I had shared a little bit earlier around just the allowing and taking things one step at a time, really, that's what Sentiment Project has been for me. It's been my, I think of it as my teacher in allowing.
Mm,
And the importance of that, and just kind of trusting the steps and not needing to define them or attach, myself, what success of something looks like, to any kind of outcome, and
yeah.
making it for me, and knowing that that's more than good enough. It's freaking great. It's the point. So just also trusting the timing when those waves come. That's why in the logo, so sentiment, the word project is underscore, it underlines me in sentiment, because it is an inside job. It starts in here. And until we work on that, those ripples and those waves aren't going to go out to help anyone else, until we're willing to show up and do the work. And it's hard. It's really
Mhm.
hard,
Mhm.
but it has to start in here for any of this to matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes when you're initially processing grief of different kinds, you can throw yourself into other things or ways of coping that you don't even recognize. I shared in the first part of grief anniversaries losing my mom, and my mom also losing her mother just before her 12th birthday. There's almost a generational aspect of that loss that's been carried through our family line. And after she passed, while there were aspects of processing the grief, there was aspects of it I absolutely wasn't tapping into. And in fact, work and caregiving for everyone else and sort of being all in gave me this zealousness for life that like I had to make the most of every moment and capture everything, which actually led to overwork and burnout is what it did.
Yeah.
And that's not uncommon either, I think, for anyone that's listening. I want to take us into our Just Be reset, which is where we focus on taking a pause to regulate, restore, and renew. Because when our nervous system is grounded, that's when connection becomes possible. I know you to be and think of you as someone who is very intentional with your time, your energy, and so much of how you navigate the world. How do you personally stay grounded while leading through something as tender as grief?
Well, first, thank you for saying that. That means a lot to me. It has been important to me to move in an intentional way, more mindfully, for a very long time. I think you're hitting on something really important, and it's even been a really big key to the way that I have taken these steps forward over the last year. is I really want to build my endurance gradually, and I wanna make sure that I'm kind of prepared. What's been cool over the last year is when I do a workshop or I add a virtual program or I go speak at something, I have felt equipped at each of those stages. And I know that might feel like a luxury. And we're sometimes thrown into things that we may not feel prepared for, but then we realize that we are. So it doesn't mean that those weren't still a little bit scary or brave steps to take, but it's been really validating and affirming to then feel really equipped and ready for it because of that kind of emotional endurance that I want to make sure that I am thinking about and evaluating and assessing each time I do something and not moving faster than I'm really ready to do that because that would be a disservice to myself, first of all. That would be a disservice for the people that I'm trying to hold the space for because I need to be able to show up in a way that creates the best optimal healing space for them. And that means the carry that I bring into that space, whether it is a live physical space or a virtual room. I think it's been really just interesting to reflect at each of those points of being feeling equipped and having that readiness at the way that tools I was building long before I knew I was even going to take these steps were kind of being cultivated. So many of my tools and just increased mindfulness in general, being able to kind of quiet the noise and present, right? Like I just love like the whole definition of what you said around the just be reset. And when we can calm our nervous systems, that's when we can also get to a place to allow ourselves to go into creative flow and for creativity to be able to be this space, this brave space where people can process their feelings and their emotions. I think rituals are a big part of my life and something I've become more aware of around that. Even when working kind of intense hours during all those advertising years that we were talking about, matcha and green tea is kind of is
Uh-huh.
a thing, like, and it's the ritual of it. It's like a reset. I can have a huge deadline. I might still have a 15-hour day or night ahead of me, but I can choose to just stop for that 5 or 10 minutes, make a matcha, sip some tea, slow down. And when I can get to a calm mindset, then that's when I can just do better work too. When I can really give myself that permission to calm the noise and to just truly be, like, as you explained, that just be reset.
I think you've talked about whether or not you're in an era of time, whether it's a rest era because you've taken a leave or you've pivoted away from something. And we know a lot of people out there have been put into positions of roles being eliminated, all kinds of things happening in our society right now. And so sometimes that doesn't feel like a rest era, it feels like a stress era.
Yes.
But in the midst of it, if someone is feeling stuck in their grief or navigating a big transition in their life, which can have elements of grief absolutely in it, which we often don't think about, what's one small creative practice someone might think about, a small call to action for our listeners?
I'm going to come back to the allowing point. I would just say allow it. Don't overthink it. Just allow it. And I really strongly believe in the power of the creative process to be that safe place to process emotions. And that doesn't mean like you have to have creative in your title, like I did for many years and do, but it just means allowing yourself to feel that and to use the creative space. So writing, you've talked about writing. I'm a big fan of writing. But before we go a little bit more into an example of that, that I would love to leave everybody with, I think remembering that just like anxiety can shut down creativity, creativity can also stop anxiety and create that calm space to be able to process. Think about the things you do. Like if you plan, maybe you're having people over or you just want to plan a beautiful meal for yourself. Planning a meal is creativity. I have a lot of people who come through the sentiment project groups and collage might be something that they do. and they'll end up taking it to places and themes that connect to the person that they're honoring or remembering in ways that they didn't expect if they hadn't just started. You talked about dance. One of the participants in one of my groups, the very first group that started back in 2020 with the Suicide Loss group, she choreographed a dance and it was in honor of her brother. And she brought the recorded filmed version of it and shared it with the group and used that as her method of sharing her story about her brother. There's just so many ways we can express ourselves. Just don't compare your grief to anybody else. Don't compare your creativity to anybody else. Just allow it. And when it happens, allow it. And don't beat yourself up when it doesn't feel like it's happening or coming. I don't know if you're familiar with Rupi Kaur, beautiful poet. She has a style of poetry called list style poems. This is actually an exercise that I do with different groups pretty often, and create a title or a theme for what you want to kind of a container to capture your feelings and thoughts and excerpts around that, and just start writing a list. And then come back to it, call it down, edit, add to it, and just write a list style poem. I think it's
Mm.
something that even if you feel like I'm not a poet, we can get imposter syndrome and compare ourselves to other people or talents and just write, just put it down on paper. That's actually happened for me where I felt so strongly about an experience and then ended up capturing it. I didn't know exactly what form I wanted it to take, but I just felt like this conviction. It was a few years ago after my uncle and my aunt had this reunion for all the cousins to get connected, reconnected, because I was such a young age when all of that had happened with my dad and with suicide. But I didn't know the form or what it was, right? But
Mhm.
at this point, a little more comfortable and sitting in the not knowing. And I just started in my journal, like capturing the phrases and the words. Then I came back to it a couple weeks later and I started giving it a little more shapeage. And then a few weeks later, I was at an event and somebody asked me to speak on State Street at Sundays in Chicago at an event about empathy and my loss with suicide. It was like, oh my gosh, this is the story I'm supposed to share.
Mm.
There didn't even need to be an end result for it, right? But that I think is just an example of just capture it and you don't need to know what it's going to become. But then that ended up being a really powerful moment for me, sharing my story in a completely different way with a completely different sort of crowd and venue. And that's a whole story in and of itself, trying to talk about suicide in the middle of a hustling, bustling festival on State Street in Chicago. But it just kind of comes back to that importance of giving yourself a container to reflect and don't feel the need to define it.
Mm. Kerri, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show today. I know our listeners will benefit from your wisdom, your insight, your creative approach to something as sacred and complex as grief. I just, again, thank you for coming on and thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for the space you're creating. Thank you for allowing grief to be such an important topic. We need to normalize discussing it more. It's just so important to me. I am really appreciative of the work you're doing.
So that's today's episode of Adaptive Humans. We're so grateful to Kerri for being here with us and for all of you for sticking with us in this conversation that we had that explored the quiet weight of grief and how it can stir up all kinds of emotions for us. And it shows up differently, not only depending on the types of loss that you've experienced in your life, but also across cultures and families and ways of processing what has occurred. So, if there's one thing that I hope you'll carry with you this week, is that purposeful vulnerability creates space for connection. And I invite you to consider a creative step to honor your grief. Write it down, maybe walk by the water, light a candle, whatever outlet suits you best. Adaptability isn't built in theory, it's built in these everyday choices to show up in our conversations, our teams, our communities, and in ourselves. Until next time, remember, I am brave, I am enough, I am brave enough, and so are you. This is Adaptive Humans, real talk, intentional growth.